Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to NASM Live. I'm Prentiss, and as always, I am here with Wendy and Marty. And how are both of you doing this afternoon?
Fantastic.
And we have the man in the middle, which is kind of foreshadowing our topic today. The man in the middle is Greg, keeping everything running today. And he salutes everybody. And of course, welcome to everyone who has decided to give up your time and join us today. So what we're going to talk about is the core. We're going to talk about core exercises, risk versus reward. Now, this isn't like a journey to the center of the earth, but Wendy, can you take us to the center of our bodies and tell us some of the most optimal ways we can train our core?
Absolutely. So again, thanks for having us. And last week we spoke a lot about the upper body versus reward. Obviously today we're going to spend some time specifically on core exercises, and then next week we're going to do some lower body for you guys. So hopefully you'll tune in for those as well. But you know, when we're really thinking about the core, you know, we want to think about basically, first of all, what is the core? And so when you think about the core, oftentimes people will think the core is just mainly the abs. And as we know, there's a lot more that goes into the core. So basically, it's your cervical spine, your lumbar spine, your thoracic spine. And if you removed your arms and your legs, everything else would make up your core. That's the easiest way to kind of visualize it. And so when we're thinking about and showing you and discussing some of these exercises today, we want you to keep that in mind, because there really is a purpose for different exercises that are going to some get into the really small exercises that protect the vertebrae, and then there's other muscles that help move the entire spine, and then some that add the movement as well as a power component. That's how the NASM OPT model is lined up, and that's why we kind of put it in different stages, because there really is a purpose. And as always, we want to maintain the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints with every exercise that we do. What that is, again, as a recap, is that the feet are pointed straight ahead. Your feet positioning is about shoulder to hip width apart. Your knees are going to be in line with the second and third toe. Your hips are going to be in neutral, shoulders in neutral, and as well as your head. So you want to try to think, when we show you and discuss some of these exercises, look at the positioning of the individuals, because everything that we discussed today, we did provide a visual. And so another key thing I want to point out before we really dive into this is that we're not saying you cannot do these exercises. We are just, especially on this one, because we are providing very common exercises, but we are showing you a lot of compensations or misinformation that is associated with some of these exercises. And, you know, you think you may be working your abs, but you're really working your hip flexors and stuff like that. So we want to kind of open it up for you to really think about the exercise, what the prime mover is, and hopefully, if you have questions, you'll join in and ask us along the way. So, with that being said, too, we're going to discuss before we dive too deep, and what is the difference between drawing in and bracing. And I'm going to go ahead and let you take that part.
Sure. So the great thing is there's been a lot of talk over the years about core activation, what the right techniques are. And what we just really want to do here from the very beginning of this webinar is kind of set the foundation to try to maybe eliminate some confusion, because there's a lot of people that would be in the draw in camp, but there's a lot of people that, well, I brace. So we want to kind of just get that out of the way and discuss it. So Wendy talked about the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. So first and foremost, we have to be in a neutral pelvis, neutral spinal position. You guys all know how to do that, but just as a quick refresher, if you're looking at your ASIS or those, bony protuberance on the front of your hip, and then you have your PSIS at the same position in the back of your pelvis, they need to be level. I always like to teach it that if I go into an anterior tilt, the water's falling out of the front of the bowl. If I was looking at my, pelvis as a bowl of water, posterior tilt, as I tilt backwards, water would fall out of the back of the bowl. Neutral would be where I can maintain water in the bowl. And that's a great teaching cue for your clients. So once we're in neutral, then what are we doing? Do we draw in? Do we brace? Well, again, that's the beautiful thing of the OPT model. A lot of this is taken care of for you, but let's really dissect it. So when we're doing stabilization training, we're trying to establish proper human movement. We're trying to teach people how to maintain neutral spine while they do other activities, pushes and pulls and squats and lunges in that neutral position, but the load is not very heavy. So that's where we teach neutral spine with that slight draw in. You only have to draw your belly button in a tiny little bit. It's not, hollowing out your stomach and really bringing that diaphragm into it, because that's now you're having your diaphragm stabilize your spine. We're looking at just activating the transverse abdominis, that muscle that wraps around that portion of your core. So a small draw in. Now, the key thing is you should be able to breathe naturally as you're in a drawn in position. Then you know someone's doing it properly. So that's what we teach first in stabilization. Well, guess what? Bracing, there's a lot of research that it works and it's great. Well, it is. It's great in your strength phase. So you've got the intrinsic stabilizers that we're talking about in the stabilization training. Then you got your global stabilizers that are the muscles that don't connect to your spine. They will naturally contract as you lift a heavier load. You don't have to think about it. So yes, as I'm picking up heavier loads in the strength and power phase, yes, I do need more than the deep intrinsic core stabilizers to safely guard my spine so I can handle what I'm doing. But the key point is, if I have not taught someone to find neutral and draw in, I would be then bracing on a spine that's not in a neutral position. So that's where they both have a purpose, but let's just layer them appropriately. And that's why Wendy and I and every instructor will always go back to the model that you've got to earn the right to go to those other levels. And that's what we're working on in that corrective exercise and or stabilization endurance. So that way, when you're ready, you're drawn in, you're in a neutral position, and then you pick up those heavier loads, your body will naturally brace in the right position.
So, Marty, you said a lot of important things there, and I want to make sure that everyone gets them. And just for context, for those of you who are listening out there, when we talk about what the core is, it is, Wendy, you said this very early on, but the core is a combination of upward of 20 plus muscles that all provide spinal stability. They aid you with movement and various other functions. Now, let's go back to what you were talking about with the draw in. And Marty, can you just take us through the technique? Because you mentioned the diaphragm, but I also see people too, when they teach the draw in and we're doing very basic level pelvic stability exercises or trunk stability exercises, I see a lot of posterior pelvic tilts using that internal oblique to compensate. So just talk us, you said it, please repeat it so everyone gets it.
Yeah, so when we're looking at neutral spine, again, when you look at a skeleton, this is how I always visualize it. A neutral spine doesn't mean I've eliminated the curves in the spine. It just means my pelvis is in a level position. And again, the terminology is that we're going to try to find neutral spine. Now, I'm not trying to change that terminology, just like we foam roll our IT band, and we in a previous webinar talked about, am I really foam rolling my IT band? I know that I'm controlling my pelvis. What happens to my spine inside my pelvis, I don't have much control over in a sense, right? I can't move those vertebrae without my pelvis. So really what I'm doing is leveling the pelvis. So I'm not in an anterior tilt where my belly button would be pointing down. I'm not in that posterior tilt where I'm tucked under. I'm leveling the anterior and anterior and posterior iliac spine, so they're level. So that way now, of course, your lumbar spine is still going to have its natural lordotic curve, but it's not excessive. And I think one of the things, Prentiss, you might be talking about too, is we've heard people get into a flat back position where whether they're on the floor or they're against a wall, they posterior tilt and eliminate that arch. And they think that it is sometimes neutral. That's not. That is a posterior tilt. And then from there, if you draw in, yes, you're still activating your transverse abdominis, but you haven't done it in that neutral spinal position. So we're looking for the proper firing of the transverse abdominis when you are in a neutral position, which is that leveling of the pelvis. So I hope I answered that a little bit more clearly.
No, you answered it perfectly. Now, and another important thing that you talked about that I want everyone to get before we move on is that the way in which you use these techniques, whether it's drawing in or bracing, it happens along the continuum. And if we're having to Bracing should be something, once you're under load, your brain should do that for you automatically. And to the extent that you can't do that, that means maybe we missed a step in our stabilization training. We're not doing anything with our bridges, learning to contract the glutes. We don't realize there's a pelvic floor there that needs to be. That's the bottom of the floor of the core. Dr. Seuss is going to call me any minute now to do some rhymes for the book. But just talk about what goes into that once we start to move along to the continuum. What are some other core exercises that all wrap up into bracing?
Well, you know, it's funny, Prentiss, I'm glad you brought this up. So in prepping for today's webinar, I was at the gym earlier this morning, and, you know, I have my routine and I go through it and I knew what I was supposed to do, but one of the things I'm like, you know what, I hope this comes up in today's webinar, and I'm glad you made me think of this. Every single exercise I do is a core stabilization exercise. Mm-hmm. Every single exercise. As I go through my routine, if I'm mentally engaged and focused on the process, I get myself set in the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints, make sure I'm neutral, make sure I'm drawn in, and then I mentally prepare for whatever exercise I'm going to do, whether it's a stability exercise, a strength, or a power. So we really, you know, sometimes I've had clients in the past go, we didn't do core today. I'm like, that's all we did. In the sense that if I'm pushing, if I'm pulling, if I'm squatting, if I'm lunging, if I'm doing everything, I'm making everything a core exercise. Even today was more of a traditional strength day for me, and I was doing pressing. The first thing I did was ensure that my core and my 5 kinetic chain checkpoints were in order before I even do a traditional pressing motion. So, you know, I just want to reiterate that every exercise should be a core stabilization exercise, regardless of what else you're doing in the model.
Okay, and I'll have a question on that a little bit later, and that revolves around direct core work. So, but we want to keep moving. So tell us about those tricky lower abs. Can you tell me where they are, Wendy?
Well, yeah, I mean, so again, you know, you tell me. So, I mean, you know, yeah, and so that's one of the reasons we want to talk about this too, because oftentimes, you know, people are like, oh, I want to focus on my lower abs, and you know, and I hate to say this, but they're looking to reduce the pooch. And so, you know, and we talked about this in our lower body, you know, you can't spot reduce. And so you can crunch and you can do all these exercises all day long, but you're really not, you're going to strengthen some of the muscles under there for sure. But if you're looking for a 6-pack, doing 1,000 crunches is not going to make that appear. You have to actually look at your diet and look at your entire program when you're going through doing this, and you're getting a program together. Okay. So, you know, Marty was the one that really wanted to talk a lot about the lower abs. So I don't want to steal a lot of his thunder. So Marty, you want to enlighten us?
I just think sometimes we joke and know it's so obvious, but there's such an a misnomer, I guess you could say, in people that come in and work, you know, want to work with us. You know, again, they think they want to work their lower abs, and again, we just need to truly understand the anatomy and the phases of training and how to have a great progressive core workout that goes from stabilization, strength into power, and multi-planar, and getting people to understand how to truly work their core, and really why the core stabilization is such an important part of everything we do, because they want to get right in there and start doing, again, all those crunches and the things that they think are going to spot reduce. And this kind of, Wendy, I'm going to slide forward, leads us to that next point of the stronger ab, you know, prevents back pain. And I know, Wendy, you and I were talking about this, and I worked in a country club where I had a lot of golfers that were in that senior population, and, you know, they're tired of their back hurting. So the only thing they thought that they knew how to do was, well, I do 500 crunches a day, and I'm like, oh, that's not necessarily the way to prevent a back injury. So, you know, I know, Wendy, you've worked so much in therapy and with elite sports, and I know you've probably seen the exact same thing with that misconception of how to get a stronger or healthier back.
Well, exactly. And, you know, when you say it that way, I mean, that brings us back again to the assessment. Look at the assessment and look at how your client or yourself is moving, and look at all of the compensations, and then make note of that, and then look at the muscles that are causing those compensations and allowing those compensations. And even if it's in the lower extremities, it really can affect what's happening at the lower back. And so by strengthening, and as Marty said, doing a bunch of crunches, if your psoas is overactive, which attaches to all the lumbar spine, and they have a huge anterior pelvic tilt, is that really an exercise they should be doing? And the answer to that in the very beginning is no. And so again, looking at the phases of the model, they all serve a purpose, because to notice there's little to no joint and spine motion in phase 1. And that's really to work on the intervertebral stability, which, as you mentioned, Marty, are the really small muscles that really help align the vertebrae and keep it in that perfect alignment before you start adding that movement, and flexion and extension. So, when we say that, abs, you really want to have strong abs, but you want to have a strong core. And as Prentiss mentioned, there's approximately 29 muscles that make up the core. So if you get those to activate first and then you add movement, you're actually going to decrease someone's back pain. But you're also looking at it as an entire program by foam rolling and stretching the muscles that need to be stretched and foam rolled, and then you're activating the other muscles to help realign your body back into, again, our first point of the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints for ideal motion and movement. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, that also brings us to the last point, which is, what is the end goal? And, we've talked about this, obviously last week, and we'll talk about this again next week, but you have to know the purpose of your program. When a client sits down and they tell you that they really want to look amazing, or they want their torso to look amazing, meaning they want to have the 6-pack abs and they want to have, good movement and feel better and look better, really look at, again, the assessment. And we keep going back to that, but you need to know the purpose of why you're designing the program. And then, as we're going to discuss moving forward, think about the purposes of the exercises that we're going to talk about. And then let us help kind of guide you and think through some of these exercises. When should it be implemented into a program? Should it be completely taken out because of certain things we talk about today? Or should you include them in your program and maybe you haven't thought about it? So.
Okay, so let's talk about the first movement. This is everyone's gold standard. This is the crunch. And speaking of the core, I can see that we're training maybe in each of these variations. We're training maybe a quarter of our core muscles. So tell us what's happening here.
Yes. And again, when we say this, we're not saying that you cannot do crunches, and we're not saying that they are a bad exercise. So I really want to really pinpoint that one statement, because people are going to be like, oh, we heard this webinar and NASM says don't do crunches. And NASM is not saying that. I'm not saying that. Marty's not saying that. And Prentiss, you're not agreeing with that. What we're trying to get you to think about is, what muscle are you targeting or supposed to be targeting when you perform a crunch? And if you're doing a crunch correctly, you should really be focusing on your rectus abdominis. And so, Marty, do you want to kind of take us through these positions?
Yeah, so the reason Wendy and I selected these pictures is there's a little bit that we can look at in each one. So let's just first focus on the rectus abdominis, what it does. If you have max range of motion, which you'd be surprised how so many people are limited in the extensibility of the rectus abdominis, you have the ability to flex your spine from each direction 30 degrees. So as soon as you pass 30 degrees, there has to be a shift in the musculature that you're targeting to get into the rest of that flexion. So as we talked about, most people are in a flex position anyways. So again, when you really want to target the rectus abdominis, which is not a problem to do when it's appropriate, keep it to that 30 degrees. Now, if you go on a stability ball, yes, you can get some extra range of motion because if they have the extensibility, but even when you come past neutral, you still only have 30 degrees. So after that, you're definitely going to engage your hip flexors, which again, we've talked about it so many different times. Most people don't need to target their hip flexors. And again, Wendy mentioned it, those hip flexors attach on the transverse process of your last 5 lumbar vertebrae. So they create a shear force. So if we're trying to protect the back, as a lot of people would do to choose these exercises, you don't want those muscles activating and pulling and creating a shear force on your lumbar spine. Same thing goes for the cervical spine. So the reason that Wendy and I chose the second picture of the female client here, you can see that the form and technique looks pretty good in her core, but you can already see her sternocleidomastoid firing. And the one rule I've always had when I first learn these techniques or when I bring in crunches when it's appropriate, if someone says, I can't do crunches, my neck's always sore. That's a huge indicator or an assessment that they're using the wrong muscles, right? Because the muscles in their core should be stable first so they can maintain their positioning of their head. So, and then when you see the other two pictures of the gentlemen, they're both going into different levels of flexion of the hip. So again, risk versus reward. Now, again, I know Prentiss is probably going to throw the curveball at Wendy on this one, so I'll jump ahead. If appropriate, right, and someone's nice and stable, mixed martial artists, they need to be strong to come up off the ground. They're willing to do these type of exercises against resistance because that's very important to their sport, especially if it's not a standing, striking only type of sport. So gymnasts, jiu-jitsu, yes, you need to be strong in this at all times. But again, remember, we don't always play sports because they're good for us orthopedically, so you got to balance that out. But if you have somebody that's not their goal, maybe you have a senior person who wants to be able to get up and off the ground. So there will be a time to do these. Just dissect the exercise. What am I trying to accomplish? What does those muscle groups actually do? And if I change that range of motion, what am I allowing to now contribute to that motion?
I'm glad that you brought that up about jiu-jitsu, because I'm in a unique position in that I do teach jiu-jitsu classes, but I also take some of the athletes there and I help them with their programming.
Sure.
And what I always do is move them out of especially depending on the game that you play in jiu-jitsu, you spend a lot of time already in spinal flexion, your hip flexors are already firing. So if we do any of those exercises, they're used in the context of SAQ exercises, appropriate for the sport. But when we do our exercise training outside of the dojo, it's moving them out of that.
Yep.
And staying true to what we teach, absolutely what we teach here with the OPT model.
Absolutely.
Yep, and I would just going to throw in too, when we say alternatives, again, we're not saying not to do any of the crunches, but as Marty mentioned, think of your range of motion before you start to fire some of these other muscles that maybe weren't meant to be targeted in the actual exercise in your design, basically your approach. And so again, we're not saying not to do a crunch. It's just think about the importance of the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints and then, why you're having someone do some of this stuff.
And one of my favorite alternatives is a standing crunch with the rope. So my head can be in the right position. And now I have to control my lumbar spine in a neutral position. Doesn't take a lot of weight. But if I'm going to go into that flexion, I like the fact that as the weight pulls back for my client, I'm really focusing on that lumbar stabilization. So again, it's just a different way to think about doing a crunch. Doesn't always have to be lying on the ground.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Wendy.
I was just going to say, and remember, ideally, we kind of bring in the crunches starting in phase 2. So, we would have spent, anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks performing exercises, again, with little to no joint motion to make sure that we don't have the forward head and we don't have any of the compensations. And so, if you want to do the bicycle type exercises or whatever to target your rectus abdominis as well as the hip flexors, because again, if a muscle is overactive, it's still weak. And so we're not saying that you're never going to have to train these muscles. It's just, again, looking for ideal range of motion and making sure that your client is prepared for something like this. Maybe not to that extreme, but prepared to do it correctly in order to get the most out of it.
And since we have some kettlebell users here, one thing that I like to do in place of that is the half get up to the elbow, which is that has a couple of different movement patterns, and it's if you can get it, it's a good alternative to just doing crunches. It's good to have in the toolbox.
Perfect. Okay. Well, then it brings us to the hanging leg raises, and I love watching this at the gym. And as you can see, the picture of this gentleman performing a hanging leg raise. His lower back looks fantastic, and this is a great exercise for your hip flexors. However, we were talking about the core. So, Marty, do you want to talk a little bit on that before I can?
Going back to why most people would do this is due to the fact that they think they're working their ab, which myself, Wendy, and Prentiss have not located yet. Again, it's just your rectus abdominis. So we can't spot reduce. Now, again, this could be done well. So the limiting factors here are going to be twofold. You have the hanging leg raise, or where people are in the elevated position. But now I see a lot of times the compressive forces because they don't have the stabilization in their shoulders to maintain that position on their elbows. So both can be inherently risky or hard for the person because they may not be strong enough to hang or support themselves in one of the other positions. Now, could somebody do this right and work their rectus abdominis, that 30 degrees that I talked about? Absolutely. But again, when your legs are further out extended from you, think about leverage. So now you've got the biggest muscle group and the most weight in your body, in your legs, and you're extending your legs, which now means the fulcrum, which is your lower back and lower portion of your abdominals, are really going to be under a lot of stress. So if you can do it, make sure that they're safe with either the hanging position or the suspended position. And then also start with the knees bent, because now you've eliminated all that extra strain and stress on the low back. And if you can do it properly, you should only see the lumbar spine flex that 30 degrees. But if you see their back straight and they're only going up and down into hip flexion, how much rectus abdominis are you doing besides, indirectly? So again, it can be done. It's a great exercise if appropriate and if done with ideal form and technique. The majority of people, though, are not executing it the way that we would like.
So let's play a little, Marty.
Yes.
This person here wants to do this exercise no matter what. And if you don't let him do it, he's going to move to a van down by the river. How does he, what are some things that you would do to regress him?
Sure. No, that's a great
build
question.
him up to that point.
So I was thinking about this too. So we always have ways to progress and regress. This is a more of an advanced form and technique. And again, I already said how when you're ready to do this, you would start with the knees bent. So if I was going all the way back after stabilization, one, you'd start them on the ground. Now, here's the way I like to do it. I like, if I can find a small stability ball, to have them support their legs on. And I actually have them dig their heels into a little bit to get a little of the hamstring flex, firing, because then their quad and hip flexor may not fire as much due to reciprocal inhibition. And it also helps physically guide them into that arcing motion. It's a very, it's not a medicine ball. If you need to regress it even from there, you could use like a decline bench and use gravity to your assistance to help teach that cueing where gravity's helping. Then you could go flat. Then you could tip the bench and go against gravity. So a lot of progressions and regressions that you can do, and there may be even more than that. Those are just three simple ones that I like to do before I'd have somebody go to this. But again, I'd start with their knees bent for sure. And then, guys, when we're talking about this exercise, whether it's the flutter kicks or, laying on your back doing leg raises, we're still talking very similar concepts from the anatomical issues that we need to discuss. We just chose the hanging leg raise.
And another thing I want to point out, Marty, is this individual seems to be pretty dialed when it comes to his lat extensibility. But again, looking at your assessment, if someone's arms fall forward, or hopefully, again, you've cued them out of that and they do have a proper extensibility. But if they are lacking range of motion or they are showing an anterior pelvic tilt, those are two key indicators that this would be extremely challenging for someone to do correctly.
Okay, so why don't we move on to another favorite? I lost my place here, but yeah, let's go to the torso rotation.
Yes, so two different types of machines that are still targeting the same area. And again, we're looking at the obliques when someone's doing this particular exercise. And when they're in the seated position, so when you're looking at picture number one there, obviously their legs are going to be under and held in, so they're in a seated position. When they're in this position, there's a lot of compression in the lumbar spine on the discs. And if they're limited in thoracic range of motion, they could be getting way too much rotation from the lumbar spine, which is going to increase pain and cause some issues later down. the road. And then, also think too, looking at the picture to the right, it's the same things to think about. Obviously you want to think about where they're rotating. And Marty, I'll let you go into more detail about that. But, they're rotating and the stress that's in the lumbar spine, but also with the knees bent, if they're tight in their rectus femoris, this can put the client in even more of an anterior pelvic tilt, which is going to lead to even more compression. And and Marty, I know you want to dive deeper in there, but those are just looking at these pictures, hopefully you guys can start to pinpoint and see some of these common areas that, are going to light up if people are already complaining about low back pain.
Yeah, and to go into it even more with everything Wendy said was just so spot on. But then first and foremost, look at the weight stack there. So what you'll see is a lot of people, they're using their arms in momentum. They're not really utilizing the muscles in their core. So there's been times where I've played around with these machines myself where I crisscross my arms and find a way not to use momentum, and the weight drops to maybe 15, 20 pounds, right? Because now you're not using your chest, your back, your biceps to go through that. You're really looking at what my core can rotate. Also, when you look at the rotation in each one of these, we could talk about where the hip internal rotation would be. You'd have to be pretty mobile. And again, that's why stabilization and all that corrective would come first before you got to the strength phase here. But I can tell you there's been times with certain clients where I've utilized this machine and all I do is give them 15 degrees rotation each way. Because if you're looking at the true, real deep internal paraspinal muscles that do connect to the vertebrae and they do that rotation, they're only doing 15 degrees, plus or minus. When you get those big rotational movements, it's coming from the hips. It's not coming from a locked position of one part of your spine. And when you see that first machine, when I lock my lumbar spine and rotate now the bottom of my thoracic spine up, you're wringing out your discs. With resistance, your spine is really supposed to move in its entirety. Yes, you can work these little interparaspinal muscles segmentally. The weight is 5 pounds minimally. So again, when you really start to dissect what you can do with that machine, and since we can't spot reduce, we're going to encourage you to do all your rotation in a standing position potentially where you can clear the trailing hip. So that way the whole spine is moving together. And then we just know there's a lot less compressive forces on the spine. And if I was doing anything such as golf or throwing a punch or a kick, I'd want to be clearing that hip anyways. So it just comes back down to what I'm going to be doing in real life if I had to do this. So be careful segmenting it that way, especially if you don't have the mobility and you're handling a pretty good amount of load there from a weight standpoint.
Yep, and some good alternative exercises to this obviously is like using cables. Let yourself rotate, let your hips rotate with you. Or if you're trying not to do that, then use something like a Pallof press. You're still going to focus a lot without putting the twisting action so much on the actual vertebrae and lumbar spine, which is often custom why you hear people having bulging disc problems that later lead to pain where they can't even get out of a chair. So.
No, that is good. And for those of you who train at home, like I do, anchor bands. Anchor bands to something. You can do chops from there. And I'm going to go back to an exercise that I mentioned a couple minutes ago, and that's just a half get up. We're doing very similar movements here. So I think we covered that one quite well. And just a reminder to everyone, if you're listening and you have questions, please ask your question now. Don't leave them, don't go back and ask those questions. You can ask them on social media, but ask them while we have these two live. Let's talk about back extensions now.
Yes, so back extensions, fantastic exercise when they're performed correctly. So again, when we say risk versus reward, we want to tell you, again, a great exercise, but we're going to talk about, as you can see in different pictures, we're going to talk about what these people are doing. So when you're doing a back extension, you're hopefully targeting, or if you're ideally trying to target the erectors. And if you look through this, you'll see that the guy on the ball is going into hyperextension, so going too far. and adding even more compression in the lower back. And then when you look at these other two individuals, and Marty, I know you're going to go into more detail about this, but if you don't have any flexion and extension of the spine and you're really bending more from the hip flexors, then technically when you come up, your prime mover is no longer going to be working your erectors. You're going to really be focusing more on the hamstring as well as the glutes. So that brings us back to the very first slide again of understanding what is it that you're trying to target? What are your prime movers in the exercise selection that you have? Because again, if you are trying to work your erectors or the muscles in your back, you're really not doing that on the other two, other than it acting as a stabilizer versus a prime mover. Mm-hmm. So Marty, do you want to go into more detail?
Yeah, and great stuff. And we picked these exercises for a couple different reasons. First of all, Wendy and I have talked before, we're not ever training muscles, we're training movements. So first of all, you can see that on the stability ball, he's not in triple extension. So we need neutral spine. Wendy's already shown you how he's going into hyperextension. The knees you can see are slightly bent, so that quad's not extended. He should be probably pushing into a wall so he can get into that plantar flexion, because that's the movement that's eventually going to be running, jumping, squatting, whatever that is. So, and then the one on the bottom, people have always asked, like, how much is too range of motion or too much, and do I just go all the way down? So first, at some point when you go too far, now no muscles really engage, so now there's going to be more stress on your spine. So Wendy did a phenomenal job talking about how you've got to get your hip flexors loosened up, because that's going to limit range of motion, or how much you can do with these exercises. And you can obviously see her position of her cervical spine is far from neutral as well. So, when you go into the flex position, you don't need to go as far as you'll see here, because now in that over lengthened position, we know muscles are going to be weaker about 4. And especially if someone's holding a weight. If they now are in a weakened position because they've gone too far range of motion, they're going to have to compensate for that. And that stress now can go to the wrong musculature, which means training muscles to work, as well as now there'll be some shift to the joint to take some of that. So again, make sure that your feet aren't externally rotated either. We see a lot when moving. So really make sure that person's drawn in, make sure they're limiting their motion as they come up nice, slow, and controlled, and really get them to focus on their glutes being the prime mover, because the low back and hamstring are going to help, but really getting them to focus on the glutes as the prime mover, and then stop them in just slight extension, maybe 5 to 10 degrees, and not into that full hyperextension.
Okay, Wendy, do you have anything else to add before we move to my favorite exercise in this deck?
No, again, when we have alternatives there, again, we're not saying not to perform these. It's just think about what you're trying to target. And if you are trying to work your erectors, then just add spinal flexion and extension, like flex it to go into the lengthened position and then slowly come out of it, and just make sure that it's controlled. Again, you need to put a lot of love into your spine. And if you just throw up a lot of weight or you go into hyperextension, the compression is really not worth it. Versus really taking the time to do it correctly and focus on your form.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's move on to our next exercise in the deck. So this one, chiropractors and orthopedic surgeons all around the world have a love-hate relationship with this exercise. They love it. Actually, they have a love-love relationship. They love it because on some level, their patients they're demonstrating self-efficacy. They're getting out to the gym and training, and they love it because this is an exercise done improperly. It's going to keep them on the table. So let's talk about the Russian twist and some things that we can do to actually get more out of this exercise or give safe alternatives.
Certainly. So again, with the Russian twist, you want to think about what is it that you're trying to target. And, here we're trying to target their obliques. And so, when you're doing an exercise for that and you're actually adding this type of rotation, you want the motion coming from the thoracic spine. And as you can see, and again, I'll have Marty go into a lot of detail, she is in a flexed position with her feet off of the ground. So her hip flexors and her psoas and everything is having to work to maintain that position. And then she's adding, because she's in a seated position, her rotation is really going to be coming more from usually their arms, if their torso stays straight, because they're just moving their arms from side to side. So that's a compensation that you'll see when people are performing this. But then also that in this picture, she's going to be getting the rotation mainly from her lumbar, like her lumbar spine, which, as hopefully the last 45 minutes of you listening to this have realized that that's ideally not where you want to get your motion. So Marty, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, I can just to this one, and I've been forced to do this one in my dojo, and it's every time it's like, oh, it just doesn't feel good, because I do my best to get all the hip extensibility I need. It's just one of those things I'm constantly working on, and there's just no way for me not to feel this exercise incorrectly. And what I mean by that is, my low back is like, why are you doing this? And it's one of the only exercises that I still would struggle with from not feeling good, because I've worked on all my correctives and stabilization. So I just totally stay away from this one at all costs for me. And again, it's for everything that Wendy just said is, I'm trying to work my core, and I've locked down my lumbar spine now. And some people rotate the legs as well. And you're just really putting so much torque and torsion in the lumbar spine. And let's, again, go by how the spine works. Lumbar spine is designed to be stable. Thoracic spine designed to be mobile. Cervical spine designed to be stable. Now, of course, stable joints still have to move, but what you end up seeing is the complete opposite in this exercise. You see people's head moving all over the place, and then maybe they're moving from their lumbar spine, and the thoracic, the one that is really designed to be rotating, can't. And again, with some limitation, hip internal rotation, now that I've fired up my hip flexors, now it's even harder for me to rotate. It's just not comfortable for me at all. So I avoided cost.
And oftentimes
there's so many other great choices.
Yeah, and you'll see a lot of people when they do this, because they lift a really heavy load, they go into spinal flexion. Then they're locked down in lumbar, their lumbar spine is actually obviously locked down. And then now they're adding this huge weight from side to side. I mean, it really does wreak havoc on the entire spine at the end of the day. Yep.
And like you said, Wendy, they're so focused on how many reps or how much weight they're supposed to be told to move. It's just, again, we're not going to say never to do it, but again, what's really the end goal? And can we find something that's more functional to everyday life? And, give them even maybe better results by getting them standing up, getting their hips involved. Maybe they can handle more load that way in a safer manner and even burn more calories if that's the case. It's just we want to preserve that spine.
Absolutely. Yes. And Marty, I'm going to have to give you some tips on leveraging your black belt privileges. You should be able to say, I'm not doing that. I'll do an alternative.
Sensei speaks, but the good news is, he has allowed me to create some more of the training program, so we're getting away from those Russian twists.
Yes. Well, I'm in the same boat.
Sensei's the boss.
Yeah. So if they're not, so let's move on, and I think we got a lot of great alternatives for core exercises. We understand what the core is. So Wendy, let's give us a recap, your takeaways, and tell us how to get in touch with you.
Absolutely. So, again, when we went through this, I just want to emphasize, understand that if you choose to do any of these exercises, hopefully Marty and I covered some risk versus reward, or gave you some different alternatives to think about implementing into your program if these were some of your key exercises. And we're all learning. So I remember when I first started out in my programming, sometimes I would do exercises and then realize later, after going to, listening to a webinar or going to a workshop, like, oh no, I've been doing that. Like I need to stop. So hopefully you're taking this in as a learning experience, and not that we're trying to pick on some of your favorite exercises. The big takeaway would be just look at the assessment, figure out what is appropriate for your clients. If they have compensations, obviously think about the exercises for your core that would involve little to no spinal motion. So planks, side planks, bridges, things like that will target the actual core musculature that's going to protect the spine. And then when you're ready to add some of these movements of flexion and extension, usually, again, we start this usually in phase 2 through 4. Just pick ones that your clients can perform safely, effectively, and efficiently without compensation. and think about common compensations we discussed and how to cue them out of it. And then at that point, just have fun designing programs and coming up with your own exercises that are truly going to target the prime movers that you're trying to hit when you're programming. Perfect. And then to contact me, obviously, you'll see it up there on the screen. It's wendy.bats@nasm.org, and my Instagram is wendy.bats13.
All right. Thank you for everything that you've done today, Wendy and Marty.
Well, Wendy, such an amazing job. I'm sorry, with the takeaway there. So just to add on to that is, just exactly as she said, what's the real purpose? Figure out what the best exercise are. And then, as I was saying at the beginning, every exercise should be a core stabilization exercise at a minimum. And then you can really start to target, do you need to train the core specifically for strength and power, which we absolutely recommend in a progressive manner. So we're just so excited to discuss the topic because there's so much great information out there. So to get a hold of me, you've got my email there, marty.miller@nasm.org. And then Instagram is dr.martymiller72. And then 2 other opportunities, guys, to jump in and have these type of conversations. Friday morning, 6 a.m., I do a coffee talk live where it's just all about answering your guys' questions. And I do the same thing on Tuesdays at 9:30, both Eastern Standard Time, where we can kind of jump in and continue these type of conversations. So hopefully you guys can check in there.
All right. Thank you a lot. Thanks again to both of you for your contributions, for your information, and I hope everyone who's listening today found this useful. Thank you to everyone who hung out with us today, and thank you, Greg, for keeping it going. So we will see you next time. Everybody have a great day. Be safe.